Okay, so just to give a bit more of the background, as I said, my own career has also been kind of simultaneous, multiple trajectories, just like my subject matter. Academically, I've focused on how complex systems evolve, specifically how economic ideas and policies evolve over time, why they emerge, kind of why they dominate at a certain point in time in history and why they die. So I focused a lot on the Chinese economic reforms and later on the World Bank and its development doctrines and why those ideas have changed over a couple of decades. And but apart from that, basically, I'm not like a full-on academic. I've worked in startups. I also have a little startup. Now I work for Gallup doing market research. I worked in back-channel peace negotiations between Israel and Palestinians. I'm originally from Israel and from Tel Aviv. I've been living in London for 12 years. And then I also joined Shimon Aveh and Ofer Greitzer, who you might have heard of, for the Operational Theory Research Institute in the IDF. And the idea was to bring the economic dimension into their innovative military thinking. And some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today have really started back then, and this is kind of context where I think that there might be synergy and some value for whatever you guys are doing as well. So complexity. My focus on complexity has always been the so what question. Why should we care? Yes, life is complex. We can analyze any phenomenon as a complex system, but the real added value of complexity is what you can actually do with it, how you can actually take advantage of complexity and actually use it in an operational level rather than just in a way to understand things. And I guess in a nutshell, like the main message I want to bring across today is that the better you are able to really understand the environment in which you operate, and the better your operations, the design of them, really resonate with the multitude of forces and contradictions that are driving your environment, the more leverage you'll have. That's it. And as you can see, I've actually emphasized emerging, because understanding the environment as it is right now is meaningless. Whatever we see right now, just as a ray of light kind of left the sun, what is it, like 8 seconds ago, whatever. These are things that have already happened. Whatever we have right now, all the conditions are the end result of an emergent process that has been going on for a while and have already kind of manifested themselves in full. What we want to understand is what is emerging out of these conditions. So think of it a bit like surfing. You're not looking at the waves that already happened. What you're trying to do is identify those emerging waves that you can actually ride. And of course, when you think about how waves are really created, they're all created by convergence and contradictions between dynamics within an environment. So really, complexity analysis helps you identify those waves, helps you identify those resonances within your environment that you can then take advantage of and exploit. So how do we analyze environments? Well, there are two things that you need to have. One is trends. You need to understand what is actually happening within a specific context, within a specific environment. And for that, you have area experts. So I'm sure that if you're trying to make sense of something in China or in Iran or anywhere else, you have specialists that this is what they do that can give you specific insights into the specific players and forces and dynamics that are happening on the ground. So that's area experts. But the other side are propensities. And propensities are different than trends because propensities are a bit like laws of nature. They repeat themselves in all complex systems. So if you know, if you learn, if you can understand the propensities that are within systems, you can better anticipate what will actually happen. So propensities are not about what happens, but they're about how things happen, about how reality unfolds. And basically, this is what I'm focusing on. So really understanding what are the internal propensities that we can then put together with specific area experts to really make sense of an evolving dynamic environment. So a few words about how we can start to unpack those propensities. First of all, what is the difference between complexity economics and traditional economics? For one thing, there is no assumption that a system will tend towards an equilibrium. So for any of you who have taken kind of economics 101, it's all about multiple players, sellers, buyers, strangers that meet in a marketplace, and in that marketplace they will converge around a certain equilibrium, which will be the price. When you take a complexity approach, there is no point of equilibrium, but rather the system continues to shift and evolve as time goes by, and actually the tendency is moving away from equilibrium. It is moving away from the initial conditions that have been created. Similarly, in economics, the assumption is that politics, culture, technology are external to the market. So these are where external shocks are coming from. In complexity economics, we assume that it's all within. So change begins within because the ecology itself already incorporates politics, technology, and culture. And these are some of the bubbling forces underneath that helps us understand where the system is going and why it is driven away from equilibrium. The third element, and we're going to go to actual examples for all of this, so I know that this is a bit abstract. The third element is the assumption of non-rationality. Now that doesn't mean that people are irrational. It just means that we don't assume that people behave in a Spock-like manner. And this is where behavioral economics comes in and really gives a lot of insights into how things unfold in terms of biases, etc., etc. And the last element that is very important is to understand that all human phenomena is network-based. So cities, cultures, religion, anything you look around is really a manifestation of a network interacting. And through that network, people connect, they exchange flows of information, of resources, and of behaviors. And out of all of that interactions, we see every single social phenomenon. So that is very important when we start to analyze what is actually happening underneath. So let's start with a couple of simple examples. First thing you learn in complexity is that everything and everyone is connected to everything and everyone else, right? Milgram's 6 degrees of separation, that was in the late 50s. I'm sure that the degrees of separation have actually declined since then. But what does that actually mean? It means two things strategically. One, if everything is connected to everything else, you can impact the system from anywhere, right? Just logically. The second thing is that anything you do will always have unintended consequences. You can never try to influence just one part of the system. It's a bit like throwing a rock into a pond, right? It will continue to ripple out, across the whole surface. You might see it, you might not, but it will have unintended consequences. So you can never try to just impact one element. It also means that we can start to make sense of how these things unfold and how they are related. So unintended consequences is a very important concept to understand. But unintended consequences and just being aware of unintended consequences, is not really useful because you need to take action. So just knowing that whatever action you take will have unintended consequences doesn't really help you. By the way, not taking action also has unintended consequences. But the key is to understand how things actually take hold, how these dominoes actually fall, and have better insights into understanding those dynamics in whatever context you're operating. So here's an example from the early noughties. What could be the connection between the scaling up of production moving to China and burglary rates in London? Can anyone guess the connection?
Job loss.
Job loss. So production moving to China would cause job loss, and then what?
Burglaries to make a living.
Okay, so you'll have a rise in burglaries. Okay, so that could be one domino effect. Any other ideas? Yes.
They're making such great products in China that everyone wants to steal them.
So increased demand, you will have more of a market for burglars. Okay. Other ideas?
I think that guy is trying to steal the Chinese smartphone, the Huawei. He cannot find it in the US, so he's going to London trying to get some Chinese product.
So the internationalization, right, of burglaries. All right. There's a common kind of assumption here. That's because we're all a bit pessimistic that burglary rates have gone up. Actually, burglary rates in London have declined significantly. And the question is why? Again, unintended consequences is not that anyone in China really cares, right? When you have increased production in China, you actually have cheaper goods. When you have cheaper goods, actually at some point in time, they're just not worth stealing. So the whole burglary business model was built on the fact that you could break into someone's home, take their DVD player or whatever, very easy to carry, take that out, make some money, move on. But if DVD players cost $19.99, they're just not worth stealing anymore. So if you think about, the victims of globalization and the left behinds, London burglaries are definitely part of those left behinds. But this is great, right? We have a decrease in crime, but remember, there's no point of equilibrium. So the system continues to evolve. So what happens when there's no point of breaking into someone's home to make money? It's not personal, right? It's a business. It's a business model. So people move to other things. And of course, what becomes much more lucrative is mugging, because you could make so much more money by, taking my phone when I walk down the street or when I sit in a coffee shop. So actually, you have this new hype in people actually mugging one another, or in people just stealing phones on the street and other small devices. Now, of course, think about what that actually means, and again, what are the next domino effects that can occur. So, for one thing, mugging is a slightly different experience than having your home broken into, right? It's very personal. It's more of a violent crime, potentially. So, public anxiety might go up. That could create multiple shifts, again, within your environment. Some of them might be political. So it's interesting, been living in London, as I said, for 12 years, and British have a real obsession with privacy and citizen rights. So for example, they don't have IDs, philosophically, because I shouldn't have to actually show who I am or identify at any point. But, and this is one of the ramifications here, London has the most CCTVs per head than anywhere in the world, right? And that is because people have agreed to this trade-off, right? Because they're afraid. So it has political ramifications in terms of what dominates the public discourse, political powers, et cetera, you know who will take advantage of all of these things, because there will always be players within the network who will identify the potential. Of course, it has criminal ramifications, so there's a shift in the criminal market. So burglaries are less of a violent, affair. You have more time to think about it, plan your operations. There's a different kind of personality for the person who breaks into homes than the one who would actually go and assault you on the street and take your phone. So there's a shift in that. There's a shift in the supply chain of what you actually do with those phones once they are actually being picked. New gang structures, supply chains emerge in all the criminal markets, and of course in the legitimate markets as well, because there's a lot more investment going into security, to gadgets that will, follow your phone, turn your phone off. For example, today there is biodetectors that can actually tell if you are using your phone and not anyone else, because we have very specific characteristics in terms of how we use our phone, in terms of how we tap, in terms of how we move whether we keep it in our pocket or hold it in our hand, and all of these things can actually be monitored today. And there's huge investment into those kind of innovation. So again, as you can see, the system continues to roll on. And it is about understanding how these things actually take shape. So generally, you will always have intersecting macro trends, but the key is that they will always have micro manifestations. So it's not enough just to say that you have a connection between the rise in Chinese production and a decline in burglaries. You really need to zoom in, moving from the bird's eye view into the worm's eye view, to understand how these things happen, really understand the why. And here the why is because the business model changed. And this shift has actually created new incentives and new constraints on what people can actually do. So you start with the why, you move to the worm's eye view, you then understand what is actually shifted in individual incentives across the network, and then you can start to make sense of that, what could be the next macro trends that we could anticipate, and therefore how will they link into other things. And it's very common in my experience in strategic workshops or not, to focus on the macro trends. It's where we feel the most comfortable, right? So we can map out a lot of them and we can put them on the wall and put some really colorful arrows that will connect them all. But unless you really zoom in to understand what is happening at the local level, you won't be able to really understand what the fallouts and what the connections could actually be. So again, unintended consequences, yes, but we can start to unpack them and really understand how they shift individual incentives and constraints within the given network. This is another quick one. So just like there is unintended consequences, another very important element when we talk about economic ecologies are economic niches. So how do economic niches actually emerge? So here's another connection, again, unintended consequences. Between the end of the Cold War, we're talking about the 90s, end of the Cold War on one hand, and the rise of cheap flights across Europe. Can anyone guess what the connection is? Why has one enabled the other?
The migration of people.
Migration of people, so how would that affect?
Was a big request for means of transportation.
Okay, so we might have an increase in demand, right? So we have more demand for flights. Problem is that usually in markets, when you have more demand, prices go up rather than down. So under your wing. So again, understanding the internal dynamics, the internal propensities of how ecologies actually behave allow you a new range of insights into understanding what you can actually do and what leverage points are. And that brings us back to the idea of networks and how things really evolve over time. And the key element here is that no one operates at the systemic level. We analyze systems, we analyze macro trends to make sense of stuff, but no one operates at that level. At the end of the day, any action you take, it's like physics. You actually intervene within flows of resources, information, or behavior. Any action that you take is actually an intervention in those flows. And that is really important, and this is exactly why you need to constantly switch between the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view whenever you try to make sense of an environment or design a new strategy around whatever challenge that you're facing. So it's interesting and very important to understand what is happening within that local environment. First of all, people are position optimizers. People will always try to have better access to those flows within the network. And that is really the underlying rationale that is driving their incentive structures. How can I have a better access to those flows of resources, information, and behaviors? in that sense, they're also driven by near future calculations, because you understand what is happening around you and how you can better your position. It's not about long horizons. It's what we call random walks, seeing what is happening, generally within your proximity and taking advantage of that. Another very important point is that human action is taken via collaboration. So from the dawn of humanity, whether you're hunting mammals or today building a bridge, you need to do it with people. Humans are social organisms. And therefore, so much of our behavior and incentive structure is based on our need to collaborate with other people. That helps understand a lot of the dynamics that seem completely irrational and in contradiction to, for example, long-term interest base. But they're there because you need other people to collaborate with. And that is very important. And that also relates to how we take risk. Because if we need to collaborate with other people to achieve whatever it is we want to achieve and to better our own position within a network, we're also very risk averse, to changing, to taking a chance for this whole network to suddenly switch and be completely disoriented from wherever we know. So better the devil we know, usually if it is a stable devil. But there's a switch here. In complexity, we call it an attractor state, where a system shifts from one position where there are certain rules of the game into a completely different mindset. And this is, especially we see that when you anticipate growth. So when people feel that generally they are making headways, they're able to better their position, their children will probably have a better future. You see people very risk averse. When people start to feel within their network that opportunities are shutting down, there is less access to flows of resources, information, there's less freedom of movement, if you like, then you actually have the opposite mentality beginning to take hold within these systems, which is actually being much more risk takers. So again, behavioral economics has a lot of research on these kind of elements, and it is very interesting to see where you are. If you analyze, for example, today, different mindsets, citizen mindsets in the developing world and in the Western world, I'm really generalizing this right now, but there's interesting research. If you want to look that up, there is a sense, for example, in places like China and India, that they are on a growth trajectory. So the propensity is very, very different than the kind of mindset you see in places like the US and definitely in the UK. And I'm sure you're all familiar with our Brexit conundrums, which seems, like a collective suicide, but there is a rationality behind it. And this is the rationality, at least that is one part of it, of when are people actually able to collaborate to just transform the system into anything rather than a rational process of thinking where your interest lies and what are the alternative scenarios and that kind of thing. So, for example, when you compare Russia and China today in terms of GDP per capita, they're quite close, right? There's a lot of poverty in both places. A third of Russians can't afford a second pair of shoes. But from the Russian perspective, over the last 5 years, they have seen their disposable income continuously deteriorate overall by 15% over the last 5 years. And in China, there are other propensities happening. By the way, also there are contradictions that are beginning to close these things up. So interesting to analyze what exactly is happening internally within that process. Another element around economics and when we start to analyze them. Economics is not something you need to develop. Economies spontaneously emerge anywhere, and they have done so, again, for millennia. So when you think about the dawn of economics, it's really like 2.5 million years ago when we find the first kind of stone tools that humans fabricated, and the assumption is that someone made it and someone traded it. So economies emerge everywhere. It's not about the formal manufacturing of economies. So anywhere you go, there will be certain positions and certain roles that you will find in any economy. So wherever you go, to the poorest places on earth, to refugee camps, you will find shops, you will find snack bars, you will find brokers, you will find midwives, teachers, builders, enforcers. And it's very important to identify who is holding those roles, because doesn't matter where it is, these roles will be taken on by someone, and this is where the structure of your network begins to take shape. So remember that it doesn't really matter where it is and whether it's formal positions or informal positions. And actually one of the biggest mistakes that developing agencies actually take is by trying to manufacture new economies where those actually exist. Because you have people who are actually holding those positions. You might be able to insert new resources to do it better, to scale things up, to allow more efficiency to occur, but you cannot just manufacture a parallel economy that is not based on the existing network. It also helps you understand why people actually might be risk adverse and actually might try to fight development projects where on the face of it, it just doesn't make sense. Because you might come in with a big project, for example, in Kibera, which is where this photo is taken from, and there's a great regeneration project. This is a very poor place, and why wouldn't you want to regenerate and build better housing and have better services? But if you don't actually incorporate the existing economy into that, you will have a lot of challenges coming from within, and you need to understand where they're actually coming from and why. And again, that takes us back to the importance of understanding the internal dynamics of the network. So going back to traditional economics, as I said, the traditional thinking about markets is that they are based on many, many strangers that meet in a marketplace, rationally exchange stuff, you end up with a certain quantity for a certain price, and they disperse. But actually, most economies, or I would say all economies, but just to be conceptually on the safe side, they emerge on a social network. The economic game is a multi-game rather than a single trade. So in specific extreme scenarios where you have a one-off game, people will probably be very rational on the exchange. But when you have multiple games, people are actually basing their involvement on the social connections that they create across this network. Because remember, we are collaborative social organisms. So one of the things we want to create for ourselves are networks. So networking is not something that has been invented in the 21st century. It is an internal propensity of our history as a whole. And there are certain propensities in terms of how people build these networks. For example, preferential attachment. We will always prefer to connect with people who have more connections than ourselves. And that is because we want to better our natural position within the network, right? If I connect with someone who is connected to many more things and many more people, then I could potentially have better access to other network flows. That is very interesting because when you think about the type of connections that people create and the kind of structures that networks then take hold, it gives you, again, insights into how information flows across a specific area. So we tend to cluster. So the people who you do make strong connections, you will be very risk averse to losing that connection. So we operate as clans, right? We have a very small group of people who will be very, very close to, and more people that we have very weak connections to. But what is really interesting about networks is that the important information actually flows across weak connections rather than the strong ones. Because where you have clusters, you have echo chambers. Because the people that I am connected with probably hold the same information and have a very similar access to network flows than my own. The further I go to other clusters, the more probability I have to get to new information, which is why you're more likely to find a job through weak connections rather than through strong connections. So understanding how these preferential attachments are actually created is very important. Understanding what are the resource flows, and understanding that all of these networks will always have their own trust mechanisms. Because the first thing that actually preceded the economy are trust mechanisms, and as I said, how people collaborate. So communication between people have actually emerged on this trust building up. So if you need, to get your mates together to hunt a mammoth, you need to know who you're going out with, right? Are they good hunters? Will they share their game? How will that possibly work? Which is why gossiping is such an amazing mechanism that has emerged within human networks. So trust mechanisms are key, and people will many times prefer to pay a price for that trust rather than having better access to resources or information elsewhere. Because once we know the people we can collaborate with, we will want to keep that as safe as possible. And here we might have interesting trade-offs because we might collaborate with them economically, but maybe also politically. Maybe the resources that we'll share and the favors that we offer these people that we're connected to will overflow between the political and the social, between the criminal and the legitimate, etc., etc. This is how corruption actually emerges. Think about, I was just reading a very interesting book about the history of the drug market in the UK. And part of the element that was really interesting in terms of how police corruption has actually emerged is also understood by the need to cultivate relations between informants and the police. So you start off with very limited, low level, perhaps a police cop, just walking the street and finding, local, very small drug dealers as informants. And of course, the whole idea is to build a personal relationship, right? But when both sides are actually successful, as a policeman, I want my local drug dealer actually to move up in rank, right? The higher they move up in rank, the more information I actually have about the wider criminal network. And of course, from the drug dealer's perspective, overall, the higher the rank of the policeman, actually also the more I will have access to information, because even though you might not want to share information both ways, you usually do. And it's all about small favors that people exchange. So it might be, my nephew was just put in jail for, holding a bit of weed. Can you help them out? Or I just need an information about a specific, little bus that is going on somewhere. And over time, it is very hard to manage these symbiotic relationships. So when we think about corruption, we think about this horrendous thing that is driven by greed, but actually, so much of it is driven by the gradual evolution of social connections across the network. And of course, once it takes hold, it changes incentive structures within. So trust mechanisms are very important. Enforcement mechanisms are very important. You can't have economic trade without someone enforcing the rules of the game. Otherwise, how will I know that whatever I ordered off Amazon yesterday would actually, be delivered on time and at the right quality? Well, it's the same if I buy something off the dark web. There are certain quality assurances, and there are certain governing enforcing mechanisms that emerge spontaneously And even if they're not the formal ones, we need to know to analyze them and to pinpoint them and really understand where the governing takes place. Because they will. There is always an enforcer. So if you look at so many groups that are operating outside of the state, and what they actually do and what they actually provide for the ecology, so beyond obviously what they take from the ecology by their criminal behavior, they also provide certain services. And you need to understand what those services are, because if you want to fight them, you need to create an organic alternative to those services. Otherwise, it is just worth paying the price. So for example, the areas that are actually most controlled by the Italian mafia will be the areas where you have the least crime. Because this is where the safe areas are, because this is where enforcement actually takes place. And we can talk about Hezbollah, and we can talk about other organizations in a similar manner. So again, all of these things are things that you can zoom in into an environment and understand the propensities involved, because you know to look for those roles, you know to look for those structures, you know how to look for those exchanges. So it's all about just knowing what are the repeatable structures that you're looking for, because they will repeat themselves anywhere you go. So it's like biology. So, you know, there's so many organisms, but at the end of the day, an eye works like an eye in all organisms, because there are certain structures and certain patterns that repeat themselves in very different environments. Which leads us to, again, another look at how propensities and how markets actually mutate. So another kind of rule of nature is that systems will always increase in complexity. Hierarchies are something that will always emerge. So this whole idea of completely distributed networks for democracy or for whatever just actually stand in contradiction to human societies, and there will always be specialization. So a great example is looking at the Somali pirates. So you think about how Somali piracy is actually developed over time. Initially, it was local fishermen who were really pissed off by the fact that you have all of these international trawlers coming in and taking all their fish away. So because Somalia was in a war, and actually there was no enforcement along its shores, you had all of these international trawlers, again, linking into what is happening in terms of the international market for fish and overfishing and regulation, so we can map all of that out. But it started off with the local fishermen just being very angry at losing access to resource. So what they were initially trying to do was just to frighten them away. But then you have a mutation, because in an ecology there is always a mutation. And I guess at some point, some guy who boarded a ship actually had the great idea to ask for money. So, you know, give me something and I'll let you go. But then suddenly you have a complete mutation, and the incentive structure shifts. So the whole objective of the operation is shifting from just get away from our beach to we could make money out of this. This could be an alternative resource flow to our local economy. So if you would have identified that mutation in the incentive structure, you could start to anticipate where this market would go. Because obviously, if you can make money off of one ship, why not scale it up, right? So let's now organize ourselves. So now that it's all about getting money, we need to think about, you know, how we get that money. Is it going to be cash? How we carry it, et cetera, et cetera. You start, you know, to become very professional about it. And of course, anywhere where you have a market, a new niche emerging, and people are becoming, you know, good at what they're doing, the next phase is venture capital, right? You have angel investors that come into the game. Again, informally, but that position can be anticipated, because where you have the potential to make money, you will have outsiders with money coming in to invest in those new markets. So you had local militias and other people from across the area coming in and telling, these little gangs, we'll give you better equipment. You can actually go out further into the sea to do whatever you're doing. We just want half, right? So you suddenly have the scaling up, and you have hierarchies beginning to emerge, and you have these structures being built around something that was very local and low-key and not a threat to anyone beyond that area to begin with. But again, there's no equilibrium, right? It continues to evolve. So next, you see how that is connected to insurance companies, and how that is connected to new services that are set up. For example, the ones who negotiate with the pirates. That's a specialty, right? People are hired and paid quite a lot of money, apparently, to do that. You have other security organizations that now need to be employed by whoever owns those ships. So you have all of this economic activity beginning to develop around this initial element. And of course, what does that mean? It means that we have an ever-growing network of people involved in that marketplace. So you have the people who actually just drop the money off. This is what they do. They take, a briefcase full of money from London and drop it off in some little cave on the Somali coast, etc., etc. And you have all of these incentive structures that begin to take hold, and a lot of them are actually about sustaining the market rather than actually shutting it down. But of course, at some point, the cost of this to the international community hits a critical mass, and this is when it is actually worth the time and effort to shut it down. But again, it is about anticipating how these things will develop and why they will not stay small and local, but inevitably you will have specialization, you will have scalability, you will have growing organizations, and most importantly, you will have collaboration across a much wider network than you had previously. Now, from your own perspective, it might be helpful that a certain market emerges. It might, keep other players occupied, or it might be detrimental to whatever you're trying to do. But understand the propensities and understand where this market is potentially going is, in any case, an important insight in whatever strategic challenge you define for yourself within that context. Monopolization is another one. As I said, hierarchies naturally are created in any market. Actually, all markets tend towards domination. When you look across the American economy today, in almost all sectors, you have 3 to 4 dominating businesses that are actually dominating that market. In some cases, it's even less. And actually, as markets develop, ironically, there is less competition. And again, that is one of the propensities that we constantly see. But we are now going through a shift of what those monopolization propensities actually manifest themselves as. And this is because, again, the convergence between technology and economics. So there is a difference between Uber as a dominant player and Apple as a dominant player. So when you actually analyze businesses, they're very similar to biological organisms. They start off, they scale very quickly, and at some point they become inefficient and die. That is something that we can see when we analyze, businesses and big corporations across history. So if you look at, the big businesses that are dominating today, perhaps only, 4 out of 100 actually existed 50 years ago, because there is a natural projection into how businesses scale up and die. By the way, that is in complete contradiction to how cities scale up and become more efficient, which is why cities are very different than corporations, but we can talk about that separately. But when we look at Uber, Uber is not about economies of scale. It's not about the fact that the more dominant you are, the more money you can put into PR and, taking over niches and supply chains and all of that, which is what Apple was doing years back. Uber has a different effect because there is an added value to the fact that people are using Uber that allows Uber to dominate. And we call that a network effect domination rather than traditional scalability. So think about it. If I wanted today to create a competitor to Uber, I would create a platform. That's not very difficult. I can copy, right? I know how it's being done now. But then I need drivers, right? I need to recruit drivers, and I need to recruit passengers. So initially, I might be able to recruit, 100 Uber drivers, right? And I might have 100 passengers. But they go on my platform, and they can't find passengers because there are too few of them. Or as a passenger, I might download the app, and I might look for a driver, but it will tell me that it will take them 20 minutes to get to me, so I'll just go to Uber, right? So there is an element that actually once Uber is there, it is dominating the market by its network effect, because the more driver it has, the more passengers will use it. The more passengers use it, the more drivers it can recruit, and this is a kind of gravitational pull. And you can very similarly understand Amazon. So there's a lot of criticism over Amazon, but I'm sure that most of us in the room have Amazon Prime, right? It is just really efficient. And of course, the more of us have Amazon Prime and we can get stuff in a day or 2 hours or 2 minutes soon, the more people will want to sell their stuff on Amazon, and therefore there's much less competition happening. So there's a very interesting element when we analyze why certain forces are dominating a certain market. Is it just because of scalability? And if it is about scalability, we can actually anticipate their demise. Or it is about a different logic that is emerging within that ecology, which is more about the network effect. So again, the concentration propensity always exists. We need to analyze it within a specific context, within a specific formation. And perhaps the last element of those types of propensities, again, they're endless, and we could have a whole discussion just about one of them, is about the fact that networks will always tend to expand, which means that external networks will always want to link in wherever they see opportunities. And this is where you see so much crossover between legal and illegal networks, where you have vacuums. When there are opportunities, there will also be international players that will come in and try to link up. Just as a legitimate business will always try to increase its supply chain, again, take advantage of economies of scale, look for new opportunities, so does everyone else. And here, again, it's very important to look at the unintended consequences that allow new fundamental shifts to actually occur inside places. So for example, the shift that has been occurring across Africa in the international drugs trade is a very interesting one. The fact that actually you have more impediments to moving money around, which means that more people along this logistics process are actually paid via drugs rather than by cash, is also having a lot of influences on what is happening in different places. So identifying all of these shifts are very important, but you can always anticipate it. So wherever you have the possibility of these international networks to come in, they will come in. So you can anticipate what these linkages of these networks could look like, and you could decide to disrupt them, and you can identify the weakness points and identify where the potential linkages could actually occur, etc. And one of the interesting things here is that they will always seek further opportunities. So if right now there is a successful bridge that has occurred, for example, with refugees moving through certain space and actually connecting different hubs, you can expect a lot of other networks to take advantage of those bridges that have actually emerged over time. You can anticipate that where people were actually able to create a supply chain that might be about drugs or arms trafficking or people trafficking or whatever, the people who are operating across this network will constantly look for new opportunities. So, they might be trafficking people, but if they have the opportunity to manufacture some counterfeit bags along the way, why not, right? So you have this constant expansion of opportunities. The stronger the network, the stronger the trust mechanisms, and the closer the connections between people across this network. So again, don't think that just because people operate in one market, they won't reach out to many others. So really, these are all examples of understanding what are the internal logics, the internal dynamics that occur in these types of situations. And of course, we can talk a lot about conflict economies and what are the specific elements that dominate conflict economies. Again, on the one hand, you might have less government control, so you might see the emergence of alternative governing trust mechanism, enforcement mechanism. But also there is a difference in the logics and incentives, because if I operate within a conflict, I can manufacture stuff, just like I do always, but I can also appropriate stuff. I can just take it away, right, if there are no enforcement of property rights. So how these logics actually occur, and if there is a possibility of appropriation, what does deterrence at the local level actually look like? What do people do in their everyday life? Because again, it all follows the same logic. People are looking for their own security for themselves, their kids, and how they can actually grow. So what does deterrence actually look like? What is the cost of deterrence on a personal level, and therefore what is the cross intersection between different players and different movements within an environment? So kind of to sum all of this up, there are 4 main ways through which you can use or kind of operationalize complexity economics in my view. The first one is through analysis. So whatever environment you are exploring, this gives you another kind of topographical dimension that you can explore in order to understand what exactly is happening and how things are actually unfolding within your environment, and actually using that to inform your design process, both in terms of identifying new leverages that you might have not noticed because they're on the periphery, and also in terms of just anticipating specific dynamics that will unfold within that environment. The second one is actual anticipation. So given that you are going to do something, what are the secondary effects that you might be able to anticipate? So going down and understanding again how that is going to affect your local burglar or whatever it is. How does it actually change incentive structures that are outside the immediate scope of your operation? So anticipation is another element. So yeah, it's unintended consequences. It's unknown, and yet we can give it some form and at least start to anticipate alternative fallouts from whatever we are trying to do. The third element is actually use it to create effects. So once I analyze the network and I understand the flows of resources and information and behavior within this network, I can actually intervene in those flows, right? I can actually use that to manipulate the system. And here it's important to differentiate between what businesses do. Businesses try to better their position within a market, right? Take advantage of new opportunities that are emerging within the market. And that is different from a player who's trying to change the system itself, to change the rules of the game. So am I trying to change the way this system works? Am I trying to change the incentive structures? Or am I within a competitive space where I'm trying to just better my position within the existing structure? So again, important to create these distinctions when you do your own analysis. But in any case, it is all about multiple interventions within those spaces that you identify averages. And the more insights you have into what is happening within an environment and how things are expected to unfold, the more of these opportunities you could detect. And the idea is, and this is part of a concept that I've been working on called social acupuncture, is by detecting multiple leverages and being able to carry out multiple operations that would intervene in multiple flows, you can theoretically shift those dynamics and that system. You're basically changing the underlying structure of a given network. And by multiple small interventions, perhaps many times to the periphery, where things are just beginning to emerge, you could have a much bigger impact on the system as a whole. And the last one is in terms of monitoring. So how can we actually, once we understand propensities, how can we integrate that into intelligence systems, into information systems that will actually help us better identify emerging dynamics in their earliest stage? So how can we better identify those shifts that are just beginning to emerge within our environment before they become obvious trends that everyone is going to try and write? So these are kind of the 4 elements that I think that you can actually use in, again, whatever the context of your own operation. So just bringing it all back in, it is all about taking advantage of complexity. It is all about, understanding how complexity works and actually harnessing it for your own benefit, rather than just looking at it as a bunch of constraints on whatever you're doing. So it gives you new ways to make sense of your system on the conceptual level, but I think it also gives you new means to impact your system on an ongoing basis. So I guess I'll open it to you guys now. I'd love to hear questions, ideas, insights, anything. Yes?
It appears to me you could use this framework and spend the rest of your life just looking at what China's doing right now and where China's going. And if you're either from a strategic level, we want to go macro, right? Trying to affect that, or you're doing it from an economic perspective, it seems the periphery, all the places they're going, what you just talked about, is where you want to apply your pins. But so how much time do you spend looking at what China's doing?
So it all really depends on the specific challenge that you have defined for yourself. So yeah, I can map out the whole world and I can spend endless days doing that. But what I actually do is I model a system that is framed within a specific strategic directive or a specific question that I need to answer. So one of the first elements is to kind of create a boundary and frame the system that I'm looking at, because you can't do it all. And within that, you then dig in to identify as many things as possible. And it's also important to think about this not as something you do before you actually take action. So the process, like Shimon Neve would frame it, is you create a model of the system that helps you identify certain logics, but actually your actions are there to test the logics themselves. So you do small interventions, you let the dust fly, it settles, and you understand where the system is going. And the point of action is actually to reveal further information about your system. But absolutely, there is a tension here in terms of how far and how wide you actually dig into these elements.
Bring it back to your comment on the cities. I'll make a hypothesis that cities are more resilient and improved because they are inherently non-hierarchical and more flexible, as opposed to a corporation or an entity that becomes increasingly hierarchical and comfortable in a particular market dynamic. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So cities are much better at innovation because there are much more open competitive spaces. And what you see with corporations, the more they scale up, the more resources they need to invest in the bureaucracy and the efficiency of those processes, which leads to less adaptability and agility. So actually, some of the conundrums for CEOs today is, could we run our corporation as a city rather than as a corporation? Tony Shea has done some interesting experimentations along those lines in his Vegas project.
So what are some of the examples of how that has succeeded?
So when you look at cities themselves, cities obviously, it's very hard to kill a city, right? So you might have a rise and a decline, but even in cities where you have decline, you will see green shoots. Look at Detroit, what has been happening in Detroit. Overall, there's actually a mathematics to this scaling up of cities. And if you look at the Santa Fe Institute and their publications, and when you double the size of a city, the efficiency, the rise in income per capita, and many, many others are actually increased by an added 15%. So there is some kind of an added value in terms of the increased network across the city, where you have density that enables more information flows across the network, because again, a city is a manifestation of the network. So you have much better connectivity and much more information flows that allows this kind of what economists would consider agglomeration effect. So people that actually compete or collaborate in close physical proximity are much more effective than people who do that far apart. So those are part of the dynamics that allow that to happen. Yes?
Just to go further what you were talking about, the city. The start of a city is because there is a resource that exists for people that are going to create the network to collect that data. There, that's where the city's going to start growing.
Mm-hmm.
So, to further that point, that the fact that China would be able to go and grow is because it realizes that there is a resource that can tap into. Can you talk to that?
Yes, so again, historically, when you look at all cities, they actually emerged around a specific resource or along rivers or something that gave them, an edge in terms of where trade can go. But actually, it is the creation of cities themselves that can create adaptation and innovation. So if you look at China, for example, and the fact that China is going to have to move something between 300 and 400 million people into cities over the next 2 decades, then what kind of systemic effects is that going to create inside China? Will they actually be able to do that? I'm sure a lot of you know the ghost cities phenomena. So it's interesting because even in a Chinese state, you cannot willfully create a city. A city is not something you can enforce. You could create the infrastructure, you could give incentives for private developers to go in and build, but you need people to move into those cities. Again, the network effect in a way, for these cities to actually thrive. If people don't come to these cities, those cities don't exist. And this is something that the Chinese can't enforce. But because you have an inclination for such increased demand for urban environments, these cities will most likely fill up or others will emerge. So there is something about why a city emerges in a certain place, and then there are the dynamics that are kind of set off once that takes hold. So think about also innovation clusters, think about Silicon Valley, and every country in the world wants its own silicon something, right? Even London has its own silicon roundabout, very close to where I live. But this is not something that you can artificially manufacture. Once there is a seed, once you have this cluster of innovation, you could do a lot of really interesting strategies to promote it, to enhance it. You could also do a lot to disrupt it. But it's not something that you can artificially manufacture. But once it's there, then you can take advantage of the dynamics understanding what will be the inevitable propensities that these places will need in order to help it grow further. Yes?
First, I have a comment on your Somali pirate example. You said negotiation, but we don't. We just kill them. The question is for us, how do you see the role of the military in this complexity economics? Not specific military, generally speaking, starting with saying the old traditional, like, war is good for business, find some or see the conflict and sell them weapons and build your economy, or the military global power competition, or the NATO role, just provide security, make an alliance, and be strong and deter the threats. So how do you see this role in the future?
So here is a very difficult position, I think, for modern militaries, because they need to venture out into further social, political, cultural, and technological dimensions, and this is a very uncomfortable place for militaries to be at. But because inevitably you operate within these environments, anything you do will have an impact on these things. And your ability to create the kind of effects you want to create locally will inevitably be dependent on these kind of dynamics. So you inevitably need to be aware of them. It's not up to the military to solve economic development conundrums, but if part of your strategic objective that you've identified actually involves creating these effects or preventing other effects from happening, you need to identify the way to, put that into your action. Otherwise, you end up taking action and are very surprised by the fact that it's not really working as you might have wished. So inevitably, I think that the movement that we're going to see is militaries operating more in this kind of foggy, muddy waters where all of these things are incorporated, and having to figure out what specific effects we want to create and the boundaries of them, and how you want to operate that further. That has a lot of other ramifications in terms of how you collaborate with other agencies, the whole, bureaucratic arms and the structure and the organizational structures of militaries. But at the end of the day, so much of understanding our rivals today is helped by understanding them as networks. And that is another important element that I might have not mentioned earlier. The idea of non-rationality is not just about incentive structures, it is also about looking at our rival as a unitary actor with clear objectives and clear interests. But Kissinger said once that Israel doesn't have a foreign policy, it only has a domestic policy, and I think that kind of extends to everywhere else. China is not a player. China is a network of people within certain power structures that operate. And you cannot understand, for example, what is happening right now in terms of trade negotiations without understanding what is happening within the Chinese leadership as a network. So at the end of the day, again, all action is taken within the network dimension. All action is local. So when you try to impact, when you try to understand your rival and when you try to impact them, you need to understand also the internal network propensities of how that operates. And it's also about how you view yourself, because you guys are also operating within networks. You're also constrained by all the other elements that characterize how networks operate. And actually, part of analyzing the model that you're operating with in order to design your strategy extends to your own networks and to your own unique point of view of that system. Because if at the end of the day you can only take action from within a network, you need to understand how that network looks from your specific position within it. So the bird's eye view helps us understand general trends, but if you want to actually design an operation, you actually need to zoom in and see all of the constraints and opportunities that are there, and some of them actually include whatever is happening on your side just as much as everywhere else. Yes?
analysts are looking at the emergent trends at the periphery, I'm wondering if you use any special controls for when you're looking at a causality, like controls for error, because like I'm thinking of how with the secondary effects of technology, it rarely has anything to do with the technology itself, or often goes away from that.
Absolutely. So it's very important to emphasize that when you take a complexity approach, there is no causality. There are simultaneous shifts that are occurring within a system. So it's not about one thing causing the other, but it is about either random collisions or ones that you can expect because of proximity. So when you analyze a system, it's not about going back and proving that one specific variable had a very specific effect. Because that is something you can only do in retrospect, historically, and that doesn't help you when you actually design an operation. Which is why actually taking action, once you've created some kind of an understanding of what you think is going on, actually taking small interventions are there to test the waters. They're there to test your assumption. So the connection, or whatever you would think about as almost causality, as the linkages between things, is actually tested by action, but you cannot actually prove it and monitor it as such.
Do you do mathematical modeling of your systems, or?
I don't. I've previously dabbled a bit in agent-based modeling, but it just proved for me very useless, because you need to make such concrete assumptions about how different agents will operate that you can basically anticipate the end result of whatever simulation you do, and if you can anticipate it, then why bother? My dream is to create a kind of Star Trek-like machine that will really be able to integrate all of this information and really generate alternative scenarios, but I don't know one that exists yet.
I love your social acupuncture concept is really intriguing, and from a organizational culture perspective, you discuss your observations and maybe experience. So on the corporate side, the new CEO takes over and is expected to have dramatic results. Certainly, we see that on the military government side, and that approach is kind of much more in the it's more subtle, perhaps more Sun Tzu than Clausewitz. So how do you develop that kind of mindset in an organization, especially one that is more comfortable with the bigger effect sooner?
It's very difficult. By the way, this was one of the pitfalls of the experimentations, in my view, of what happened within the IDF in the first trialing out of these kind of thinking. It is an anti-heroic kind of process, because if you do it really well, you do it at such early stages of emergence that all the other players just assume that this is how reality unfolded naturally. So it's very hard to find an alternative function to that ego, I made this happen kind of mindset. And the question is that mindset a propensity that is inevitable within all systems, or is that a gender bias that we can create an alternative system where leaders might operate differently? Big question. I don't think that has been resolved. Absolutely. And also the whole hierarchies element. Another element is that the insights should actually be generated by the people who actually design the operations, actually going and packaging those insights and delivering them, as sound bites or kind of agglomerated insights into higher echelons is also one of the challenges when you do these kinds of, deep insight dynamic modeling. Definitely a challenge.
thank you for your presentation today. One of my interests is you use the concept of time. You say over time.
Mm-hmm.
You do some examples, Apple, Uber. What kind of time are you thinking of when you say over time? Are you talking generations? Could you point out if you've done it correctly, these active function things, the reality that everybody experiences is the reality you create. So could you explain to me what you're thinking of in over time?
So I guess it's really context driven. So when you think about how things evolve in biology, time is generation, right? So organisms will always adapt to new situations and new environments and take advantage of whatever is happening, but they don't do that consciously. They do that through mutations, intergenerational random mutations. What we have as humans is innovation, so we can do it within generations rather than as random mutations. It really depends on the specific context. So if you're looking at, I don't know how long Uber has been around, but is it like 5, 6 years, perhaps even less? That's a really short time, right? In other cases, it would be a much longer time. It's also about what is the specific strategy that you're trying to push. For example, with Brexit, it seems like suddenly you have a kind of surge of elements that came together and brilliantly taken advantage of by very good strategic forces to enable Brexit to actually happen. And that was a complete switch. No one expected it to happen to a large extent. You just started to see, the shift bubbling underneath the surface. When you started to talk with people I was really surprised at that suddenly said, yeah, we're not really sure how we're going to vote. And I was like, really? You're not sure? Then that is actually a signal that something is happening, on a wider scale. So it is time because it is all about kinetic effects within the networks, but it's really context driven, whether it's generations or whether it is something, very tangible and immediate. I'm not sure I answered that, but.
So you spoke earlier about the fitness landscape and the idea, and then I want to couple that with the idea of the fitness landscape and complexity plateauing for analysis and then also add into it the idea of the bureaucracy. And I assume that over periods of time you've advised people, businesses, and the like that have become bureaucratic in nature to take themselves off that fitness plateau and to look at things in their systems differently. How do you push them off of that fitness plateau to be uncomfortable in their analysis and their willingness in those challenges? And I know that resonates here within a bureaucracy of a command, but it also resonates individually in our own network system within that bureaucracy. So any insights or things that you could provide?
I think you basically replicate the challenge, but internally as well as externally. So moving from that plateau on the fitness landscape, so you're on the peak, but there's a bigger peak, but you need to go down to get to it. It has a cost. Every transition in the system carries a cost. Moving to peace is a wonderful thing. It carries huge cost to move to a peace environment. And from my experience, it's all about finding resonance within the specific bureaucratic landscape as well. So it's really about, what's keeping you up at night. So whoever makes the decisions, the echelons you need to get to, you need to understand what they actually need. And if you find a strategy that resonates with what they actually need, then the cost of taking action is much more palatable. So, for example, I did a project with it's really, peripheral group of people who came out of the advertising industry and said, we're making a lot of money, we're doing great things, but we think that advertising is really shit and bad for society and the environment and whatever. And we want to change the environment. We want to change the advertising sector. Can you help? we think it's complex. And I said, yeah, it's complex. But the idea was that they were trying to operate from within. They weren't trying to create a campaign network to try to influence advertising or regulate advertising and do that from the outside. They were trying to find a strategic insight that would cause advertising CEOs to decide to shift into a more purposeful, aware, socially aware type of work, because advertising actually operated as a value-neutral system. And what was interesting is that so much of our analysis was about analyzing what was happening within the advertising sector. What are the strategies that is dominating their approach right now? What is their peak? And showing them how so many other trends within the environment are causing strategic drift for them. So again, environments continue to shift all the time, right? So if you can identify the strategic drift and actually show those people how their abilities to operate the way they're currently doing is actually either having less impact or becoming harder, then they will be much more receptive to taking a different approach. And what is interesting is that we went through a whole process. We analyzed something like 153 trends before we identified the actual strategic drift and the rationale we wanted to propose to those CEO leaders. And because they were coming from advertising, they had connections, to all the big guys. I can't say that the strategy that they took on actually created a shift, but what was really interesting is that over the last 5 years, they started 5 years ago, advertising has gone through a huge shift in terms of purposeful advertising. If you see so many big brands, it's all about actually taking a political stand, actually trying to promote certain social elements, stuff that 5 years ago when we did the initial interviews, they didn't want to hear about. But it was about understanding their strategic drift, how they're moving down the food chain in terms of their relationship with brands, how they're having a hard time recruiting talent because now, young people come into the game and they ask them questions at the interviews that they have no idea how to answer. I'm working with all companies, whatever. So it was showing all of these things that are created the strategic drift for them and saying, here's a strategy that will allow you actually back on a new horse. But it's absolutely a challenge. Yeah.
Yes, so this is a really interesting brief that you gave.
Thank you.
I had a question about how you said the system tends towards domination, and then within that, either changing the system or changing your position within the existing system. Can you talk more towards that about somebody and tying that to actions are there to test the system? So changing the system or changing your position within the system, and then what actions, how that would sort of work.
So that all goes to the issue of intentions. We can, in retrospect, analyze a lot of people, position strategies that changed reality, changed history, right? But the question is, were they trying to change history, or did it just happen? So think about Steve Jobs. I mentioned Apple, right? He had huge impacts on so many different sectors, but he was trying to make a better phone. He was looking at the existing competition. He was looking at the phones that were out there. He was looking at what the needs were, at the time. Some of you are as old as I am, I think, in the room. So you would carry, an actual diary, an MP3 player, and something else, and an actual phone. And the idea was actually to package them all as one, right? That's great. So he made a huge impact, but he was trying to compete within that space. He wasn't trying to set off a whole new revolution. If you think about the poor guy that set himself on fire, that started the whole Arab Spring, that was an event that started off a lot of things. It wasn't an intention that actually created all of these waves. So that is operating within a system. And for the most part, businesses operate within these systems. They actually identify new emerging trends that they can, or resources within their environment that they can utilize, and it's all about bettering positions. So just as individuals want to better position, we can replicate those propensities at a company level, generally speaking, right? When you look at political campaigns, I mentioned Brexit. They were not trying to better their position within the political competition within the UK. They were trying to shift the system. So they were looking at what are the strategies that we can actually utilize to completely change the rules of the game rather than just better our position within the game. So they were, again, it's a very interesting story because, you know, Nigel Farage and his friends started at the periphery. They had no access to power, no access to money. The political competitive landscape within the UK doesn't allow new parties to actually rise because there's winner-take-all regional systems. So they identified actually the EU Parliament as a great resource and platform because nobody cares about EU elections. They could get elected because you only needed a few people to support you and organize that. So they moved through all of these sections of identifying new resources, of identifying new opportunities. So they basically just created a lot of infighting within the Conservative Party rather than trying to push on their own agendas. They found weaknesses within the system that they could utilize to destabilize it enough. And of course, they did it under the radar in a way where the political leaders thought, yeah, you know, it will never pass. Let's just get it out of the way and move on. And then what they did brilliantly in their actual campaign, if you look at their campaign strategy, it covered anything but the EU. They were basically trying to identify these multiple anxieties and frustrations within society and try to connect it all through the EU example. So utilizing all of these elements to shift the rules of the game. And even if there won't be Brexit, which I still think is a 2-to-1, they have still completely changed the system. If you look, again, the example that I just gave about advertising, that was about changing how the whole sector operates rather than creating a new advertising agency and dominating the market. So again, understanding if you're trying to change the rules of the game or you are there to dominate an existing system and actually you have an interest in maintaining the current system rather than moving to a new one. So it's just part of understanding your initial directive in terms of who you are and what kind of impact you want to have.